Hi, this is Mr. Mayor here, and in this video we're going to be thinking about how children learn about counting, and then I'll be sharing some ideas of how you can support your child with their counting at home. We're going to be thinking about the counting principles identified by Gelman and Gallistel in 1986 and that have been subsequently used in a lot of academic research on how young children learn to count and in the development of our understanding of maths mastery in this age group. As you can see here, the 5 principles are the one-to-one principle, the stable order principle, the cardinal principle, the abstraction principle, and the order-irrelevance principle. And Gelman and Gallistel went on to divide these into 2 groups, those that think about how to count and those that look at what to count. We're going to be looking at each principle in turn in this video and thinking about the ways that you can develop an understanding of how your child is learning to count and then how you're able to support them further at home. Let's begin by thinking about the one-to-one principle. You might have also heard this referred to as one-to-one correspondence. This principle refers to the need of matching one counting word to each item in the set to be counted. To understand this, children need to be able to recite the counting words in order, coordinate the touch and oral count so that they happen at the same time, so they might be pointing, touching items and counting. This is all important in the process of counting as it ensures that each item is included. Let's illustrate this principle by looking at these giraffes. Now, as adults, we're probably able to instantly subsidize and identify the fact that there are 5 giraffes here without needing to count them. This is something that young children find very difficult and is an idea that will be revisited again and again throughout their time in reception. So for now, we do want to count, and we're looking for that one-to-one correspondence. That is, for each giraffe, the child is able to say the correct corresponding counting word, like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As I counted, I touched each giraffe so that I knew that I had counted it. Keeping track of items that have been counted and those that have not been can be very difficult, and children can find it easier if they're able to move the objects. These giraffes that we have on the screen are only pictorial representations of giraffes, so already there's a level of abstraction. This can make it more difficult, and so I would always suggest at this age to take it back to the concrete, so to have physical objects in front of you that the child is able to move and to manipulate as they count. So the principle is still that one-to-one correspondence, that as I touch each giraffe I'm going to count it, but this time I'm going to move the giraffe so that I know those that have been counted and those that haven't been, like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are no giraffes left above my line, which means I've counted all of the giraffes that I started with, and I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 giraffes below the line. Soon we're going to be thinking about the cardinal principle and identifying how we know what the total is. But for now, let's think about ways that you can support your child with this one-to-one principle at home. Providing regular and varied opportunities to count and to hear other people counting is one of the most significant things you can do to assist your child in their mathematical development at this age. In terms of the one-to-one principle, this means getting concrete objects and allowing your child the opportunity to move them as they're counting, just like we were doing with the camels, making sure that they understand the idea of knowing things that they have counted and the things that they still need to count. If you find that your child is confident already with this one-to-one correspondence, you might encourage them to challenge themselves, still working within 10, but this time asking them to give you a given number, so for instance 6, out of a larger group. So you might gather 20 stones at the park and ask your child to give you 6 of them. This ensures that they are really confident with that one-to-one correspondence, and it's also beginning to embed basic addition and subtraction principles. If your child appears to be struggling at this stage, I would really recommend that you focus on the numbers 1 to 5 at first, and even strip it right back to 1, 2 and 3 if necessary. Use lots of repetition with different resources and really model, so explicitly emphasize, even if you feel like you're going over the top, so that they're scaffolded in their counting. Now we're going to think about the stable order principle. Children need to also learn to say the counting words in order. Usually, young children's counting string will consist of the first few words learnt correctly, a group of correct words with some omissions, followed by words chosen at random. Learning to count in the English language is complicated as it involves rote learning of words that do not have a recognizable pattern until we get to the number 14. Initially, children may just be chanting words memorized through rhymes and stories with it not having much meaning. Increasingly, the order of words takes meaning and children will begin to realize that the order of counting words is always the same and must always be said in this order. This is the stable order principle. We're going to think about the stable order principle by counting from 0 to 10. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now we're stopping at 10 for now, as for maths mastery and reception, that's the number that we really want children to be able to work up to and within to really grasp the maths curriculum. That doesn't mean that we won't be thinking about larger numbers at times, or even sometimes going below 0 to think about negative numbers. But to be where they need to be by the end of the year, that mastery of 10 is really important. To really get and understand the stable order principle, children need to know that it does matter what order the numbers are counted in. You could test this with your child by playing around and counting a group of objects but saying the numbers in the incorrect order and see what their response is. I think a lot of children at this stage will be able to identify, even if they might not be able to verbalize why, that there is a problem. If your child is unable to identify that there's a problem, then you'll know that this is an area that will be important for them to work on. So to support this principle at home, sing counting songs and read books that include counting. And like we talked about with the one-to-one principle, the more that you can model, scaffold and excite your child to want to be involved with number, the better. So think about all of those nursery rhymes, all of those songs, the speckled frogs sitting on the logs, everything like that, and involve them in your regular routine. And this is definitely something your child will have been exposed to if they've been in a preschool, nursery, childminder setting before. If you think your child is confident with this principle already, have a go at counting on from a number. So instead of getting them to count on from 0 each time, you might say, can you count on from 4? And your child would say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they're really demonstrating that they've got a great grasp of this stable order principle. Equally, once they're confident counting forwards to 10, you might challenge them to count backwards. Now, for a lot of children, this can be easy and rote learning counting from 10 through to 0 because they're used to it for a takeoff or a rocket launch. And so really challenge them by saying, can you count backwards from 8? Can you count backwards from 7? And see how they do. If your child appears to be struggling, again, as with the one-to-one principle, think about numbers 1 to 5 before you move on to those up to 10. And find one counting song that you know they really enjoy and try to act it out with toys or objects. So I used an example of the speckled frogs earlier. You might get 10 little frog toys, you might get 10 objects to represent the frogs, and really starting from 1 to 5, work on physically moving. Again, emphasizing the concrete aspect of maths before we move on to the pictorial and then later the abstract. We're now going to think about the cardinal principle, and this is the last of those how to count principles that we looked at earlier. Children often learn counting as a process without understanding that the purpose is to find out the total number in the set. In other words, not realizing that the final number in the count is not just identifying and labeling the last item counted, but that this final number is a representation of the total number of items. The cardinal principle usually develops after the one-to-one principle and the stable order principle. And so really think about how your child is doing with those first two principles before you begin to think about the cardinal principle. It is therefore important for adults to make the purpose of counting clear, emphasizing the final count is representing the total amount. You could do this by gesturing at the end. So once you've counted a group of objects, use a circular gesture, wave your hands over them to say, this is all of them, this is the total, this is how many we've got. Let's think about the cardinal principle with these giraffes. I'm going to count them, and this time they're not going to move, but I'm going to touch them each time I say the corresponding counting word. So I started on 0 because I want to really embed that understanding with children, starting from 0 when they're counting, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so that was really the one-to-one principle in action, and some of the stable order principles. So I understood how to count, I've attributed a counting word to each of my giraffes, but I haven't quite reached the cardinal principle, and this can be a stage that children often get stuck at this age. So not only do they need to be able to count the giraffes, they need to realise that that final number, the 8, represents the total value, how many giraffes there are in this group. So you can see here it has a green circle around it because it isn't just that I was trying to identify the giraffe that was number 8 when I was counting, it's that I want the child to realise that there are 8 giraffes in this group. How to support this principle at home? So you could play matching games. For instance, you could get 8 cups or plates and put them out in front of you, and then ask your child to put 8 grapes or pieces of fruit, pieces of cucumber or carrot, with 1 in each cup. So they're really having to think about how many they need. They're not just counting how many there are, but they're thinking about what is the total value that they need for it to match. If your child is really confident at this stage, you might think about combining 2 groups. So again, some of that early addition and finding the total. If they're struggling, as we said with previous principles, take a step back and look at smaller numbers, really thinking about consolidating the understanding of numbers 1 to 5 or even numbers 1 to 3, and repeatedly using the question and modelling the phrase, how many are there? There are 6 in total. There are 10 pieces of pasta here, emphasising to the child that counting has a purpose. It isn't just counting as a rote learning, it's understanding that there is a reason why you're finding a piece of information and you're telling somebody something. The fourth counting principle we're going to be thinking about is the abstraction principle. This principle refers to counting when children are moving on from counting objects which they can see and touch, so those concrete objects, to counting through hearing and imagining items as they say the words. For many young children, their counting experience is limited to using simple counting objects, and so you might find that this is a principle that is really useful to work on with your child at home. I'm going to illustrate the abstraction principle now by counting a series of clicks. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then, because I couldn't hear any more clicks, I had found my cardinal value. The total number of clicks was 9. This can be really difficult, so it's something I would say don't worry if your child finds it hard, but please do keep modelling and experimenting with it at home. This might involve clapping and the child counting. It might involve dropping something into a box or pot so they can't see, but they can hear it. Other ways to support this principle at home might involve counting sounds in the environment. So you might sit and listen for cars going by, the sound of doors closing, sounds from the street. If your child is finding that they're confident with this, you might think about counting abstract ideas or things that they've seen in the past. So for instance, you might ask them, how many cousins do they have? So that's something they're going to have to think about. They might try in their heads to picture their cousins, think through. You might ask them how many pets they have. Any questions that require them to count, but without allowing them to have something physically in front of them, will help with this abstraction principle. If your child does appear to be struggling, remember you can always focus on smaller numbers, so the numbers 1 to 5, and really think about embedding that one-to-one correspondence. So clapping together, counting together, you clap and say 1, you clap and say 2. Even if your child is finding it difficult to join in, that modelling and that scaffolding will allow them to begin to develop this abstraction principle. The final counting principle we're going to think about is the order-irrelevance principle. Understanding that the total number in a set of objects will be the same when objects are counted in another order is a complex concept for young children to understand. Children may need to understand the cardinal principle more fully in order to develop the order-irrelevance principle. Let's count these giraffes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7 giraffes in total. So I've illustrated that I understand the one-to-one principle. I understand the stable order principle. I understand that there is a final total that I'm looking for, and 7 was the number of drafts that I have in this group, so I understand the cardinal principle. Now let's look at the order-irrelevance principle. So I'm going to count these drafts again, but I'm going to count them in a different order. I'm going to count these drafts again to illustrate the order-irrelevance principle. So this time I'm going to count them in a different order, starting with a different giraffe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have no more giraffes left to count, so 7 is my final answer. The total number of giraffes in this group is 7. There's that cardinal principle in action. I had the one-to-one correspondence, the one-to-one principle, as I counted, and that stable order principle. I'm illustrating the order-irrelevance principle here because although I haven't counted these giraffes in the same order, the total number hasn't changed. And that's the really difficult thing for children to grasp, that if you have a group of objects and ask them to count them, and then move them around so you haven't changed the number of objects there, but they look visually different in their order, it can be really difficult for them to get that there's still the same number there. Let's try this one more time. So here I've still got those giraffes, and adults again, we're probably able to substitute and realize that there are 7 there by looking. And I'm going to count them in a different order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So my 7th giraffe, the giraffe that I counted last, is different from the times before, but there are still 7 there in total. So there's my cardinal principle. I need to know that the total number of giraffes is 7. I had my stable order principle as I counted, and my one-to-one principle, knowing that I needed to count each giraffe and attribute a different counting word to it. To explore the order-irrelevance principle at home, try asking your child to count out a group of objects with a total of 10 or less, and then you muddle them up and ask the child to count them again. Repeat this and see how long it takes for your child to stop counting the objects and be able to tell you the answer. This might begin to demonstrate that they're grasping the order-irrelevance principle, but don't worry if it takes a long time to do this or if it doesn't happen at all. If you are finding that your child is presenting as being confident with this principle, try giving them a mixed group of objects and asking them to count how many there are of each type. So for instance, you might have some beads, some pasta, and some small toys. And then ask your child to count how many there are of each type, and then muddle them all up so it looks very different, and ask them again how many there are of each type. Keep doing this and see how long it takes for your child to be able to identify the number without having to count them again. If your child is appearing to be struggling, remember, always focus on smaller numbers and really grasp that understanding of numbers 1 to 5. And repeatedly model counting the objects yourself. So model counting the objects to find a total before modelling and then counting them again. And even if at this stage and at this age, you as the adult are having to do that and they're just watching, that's okay. So there we have it. These are the 5 counting principles that we will be thinking about in reception throughout the year and moving on into year 1 and the rest of the primary maths curriculum. Remember, this was a video designed for adults to give you an understanding of how your child is learning to count. This isn't the way that we'll be sharing this information with the children. Please also remember, as I mentioned earlier in this video, that our magic number is 10. 10 is the number that we're going to be thinking about mastering. There'll be lots of other ways that we're going to be doing that this year, and we'll give you more information and more videos like this as we do move forward. I hope this video has helped. If you do have any questions as ever, just send a message through to me on Class Dojo and I'll get back to you. Take care. Bye bye.